All right. Welcome back to Ground Zero Salem. As always, I'm your host, Pat. It's been a little bit of a hiatus. Not too long. I think it's been like 10 days. I've been wicked busy, working a bunch of extra shifts and stuff like that. I'm about to go on vacation, so there might be a little bit of a gap there as well. Going home to Syracuse next week, visiting some people. Should be a good time. A much needed vacation. I'm off for 2.5 weeks, which I'm super excited about. Also going to Philly for the Metal and Beer Festival, so maybe I'll see you there. Right now we're listening to Ringworm. The Promise is a reissue on Death Wish. So this is going to be another episode of installment of the series Subgenre Wars. I haven't done these in a while. Last one I did was Youth Crew versus Grindcore. Haven't really been inspired or can think of anything for another one of these, and then I started brewing this up in my brain about 2 weeks ago. Kind of taking my time revisiting some of this stuff, thinking about it. It was partially inspired by Mike Seatown and brand spanking new YouTuber Justin Stubbs. What I'll be talking about is brutal thrash. Some people call it brutal thrash, some people call it extreme thrash, some people call it death thrash. We're going to be talking about bands that kind of bridge that gap between thrash metal and death metal, or are so extreme in the thrash realm they're almost death metal, whatever. Versus 90s metalcore, or you could call it 90s metallic hardcore. Metalcore wasn't really a genre yet. Justin and Mike have talked a lot lately about Justin's just going through his record collection, and Mike did a video of a top 10 of metallic hardcore bands. Justin's mentioned a few that, just going through his CDs that he grew up liking, and I grew up through that period as well, and a lot of those bands are near and dear to my little black heart, but I'm extremely picky about them. There was a certain period where I dropped off and I never got into a lot of stuff. Like, I never got into Converge really at all. Saddest Day, wicked good song, but beyond that, never really cared for them that much. A lot of my friends got into stuff like Torn Apart and Disembodied and Turmoil and all these bands, and they just never clicked with me. But the very early 90s stuff I got to be a pretty big fan of, and a few select things from the late 90s as well. So I'll be talking about that, and comparing it and contrasting it, I guess, with brutal thrash, which is a genre, brutal thrash, microgenre, made-up genre, whatever, certain sound that I'm very, very fond of. But and there are a few classic bands that I listened to back in the day, like Sadist. But a lot of that stuff I've gotten into more in the recent past, like the past 5 to 12 years or so. Kind of loving Sadist and Demolition Hammer, and kind of digging more into bands of that ilk that were a little bit more obscure. So we're going to talk about both. Normally I try to find a band that bridges the gap between the two. There isn't really a band that kind of played both scenes. They completely existed almost on different planets, really. The brutal thrash stuff being around from the late 80s up until like the early 90s was its time of prominence, and the whole metallic hardcore thing kind of starting at the same early 90s up until like the late 90s, before it turned into that at the gates worshiping stuff with breakdowns that I really can't stand. The closest I can think of, is, at least sound-wise, that comes in between is Ringworm and this great album, The Promise. This, came out on Death Wish a while back. Great reissue with all these kind of cool woodcuts and stuff. I also have this on vinyl. It's one of my favorite records, at least in my top, 100 LPs or something like that. Just this weird mix of 80s, late 80s New York hardcore with really evil bent to it, misanthropic, sort of occult influenced lyrics. It's no surprise that they gigged with and were buddies with Integrity. Vocally, the delivery is very John Joseph and very Ray Cappo sort of, but just way more just of an evil sort of thing that Human Furnace was doing with it. He developed his vocal chops to be way more powerful and growly later on when the band reformed. Some of those records are cool. I don't own any of them, but I do like them. But this is really stripped down and nasty. You can hear, bordering on blasting. There's some tremolo picking. Still, it's got that, like, not too distorted guitar that almost brings to mind, like, Game Over by Nuclear Assault. I can't sing the praises of this enough, and it's enough of a bridge to pick something to play in the background. So brutal thrash, death thrash, whatever you want to call it, extreme thrash. I love this stuff. I eat it up like candy. There's a good deal of newer bands that are doing it lately that are doing it very well, including Ripper from Chile, who I've talked about a number of times before. We have Aggravator. This came out on Head Split. This band is from the Midwest, I believe, Chicago. Laceration. This band called it a day a while ago, but have recently reformed. They're from the Bay Area, like a lot of the bands I'll be talking about. This is a killer demo, Realms of the Unconscious. This is getting reissued on Unspeakable Acts along with their other demo, and hopefully, since they've reformed, they'll be recording some new material because this stuff slays. And Repression, who are from Europe, Scandinavia somewhere. Where are you from, Repression? Where are you from? Finland, it looks like. I've talked about them before. Memory like a sieve. But yeah, this is a fantastic demo. Really, really great, and it came out on Caligari, who are also an excellent label, as you know, that I'm a big fan of. So going into the classics, obviously you can't go wrong with Exhorter, the band that everybody says Pantera stole their sound from. Definitely not on this record, because this is a relentless thrashing beast. Slaughter in the Vatican, this is a cassette that came out on RC back in the day, 1990, if I'm not mistaken. The vocal style, I can definitely see why people say that, you know, Phil Anselmo was ripping this guy off. It also, you know, brings to mind, like, Phil Rind from Sacred Reich. And I think James Hetfield probably influenced that style a bit, too. Not directly, but maybe somewhere in the delivery. But, yeah, extreme thrash stuff. Recorded perfectly. Cashy. Just an endless bouquet of delicious riffs. It's wonderful. Another one that was one that I was exposed to way back when that I loved, and I do remember actually being kind of disappointed by this when I heard it, because I was expecting death metal and I got just, you know, whiplash-inducing thrash. Love it now. This is Swallowed in Black by Sadis. A lot of people like Chemical Exposure more, Slash Illusions, the first record. I still don't own that. I've listened to it a lot. It's great. It's definitely more feral and fast and loose and crazy than this one, but this one is just so perfectly recorded and executed, especially the bass playing of Steve DiGiorgio. Audible, about as loud as the guitar, going off and doing its own thing. Beautiful bass playing, as you probably know if you're a fan of metal of the extreme variety. He went on to play in Death, and he also played in Autopsy doing session stuff. But yeah, the bass carrying a little bit of a sense of melody is great on this. It's got more straight up kind of thrash sort of vocals on it. And they even do like a quick, fast, almost kind of crossover song, In Your Face. But yeah, this is a wonderful record. I'm a big fan of that one. Known it for a long time. When I started digging a little deeper, maybe about 10 years ago or so, I got into Numbskull. This is Ritually Abused. This is an original pressing. This is on Medusa Records. I had it originally on cassette. I kind of wish I still did, because it'd be cool to have, but I have a tendency to flip stuff that I have more than one copy of, or multiple formats, rather. But, Chicago area band, definitely from Illinois. More extreme vocals than Sadis, I'd say. And there's some kind of weird effect on them that makes them almost sound like they're going down a drain or being flushed. It's this weird sort of, I don't know if it's a flange or delay or whatever, but it really brings something a little kind of just unsettling to the vocal delivery. And the vocal delivery itself is perfectly right between thrash and death, and almost like a little bit more of a high-pitched, like Mark Groove from Morgoth. great juxtaposition between fast and slow on this too. I think the common thread between a lot of these bands is the thrash beats that are being played so fast they're almost blasts, or blasts that kind of sound like the sloppier or slightly more off, slower kind, like the kind that Cryptic Slaughter's known for. And this band does that divergence between the two tempos really, really well. The mosh parts are super hard hitting, and it's a fucking great record. And then I don't know how many years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Hell's Headbangers reissued this Insanity LP, Death After Death. Kind of trying to track like Insanity's whole career is really difficult. I wouldn't say really difficult, but sort of confusing. This was recorded in 91 and 92, released in 93. All the songs were written between 85 and 87. They had a bunch of demos back in those days, and I mean, they're pretty rough sounding. I think I got one as a bonus 7-inch with Snake Pit Mag, and it's more or less a rehearsal demo. But they're not really playing anything really different. If you listen to their old demos, they're still playing just as fast, and it's like, it's in 1985. You know, I think even back then they were giving Possessed like a run for their money in terms of like extremity. Really great band. And speaking of Possessed, it's almost like Possessed gone technical, I feel, for lack of a better descriptor. And out of all these bands, I feel like the riffs are the most complicated, probably, the most technical, kind of confusing riffage, you know. It's a full frontal assault on your senses here. Fucking really good. And they also were from the Bay Area. So this is really cool, and I also have this From the Grave compilation, which was the first thing I picked up. I bought it at the Newbury Comics warehouse. I used to work in the internet division of that particular establishment. I was the guy who priced CDs that went up onto Amazon, and this was for like net sale only. You know, it was only available to be sold online, and I pretty much begged and pleaded with my boss. I'm like, I don't care, I'll pay $20 for this. I want this CD. It was around the time that Leaders Not Followers came out, and Napalm Death covered, can't even remember what song they covered. Napalm Death covered one of the songs on here. And this is also excellent. This is really, really confusing because it has a bunch of demo tracks with vocals re-recorded 7-8 years later. There's demo tracks from like 85, but the vocals are recorded in 93. So you have this really raw, like demo quality, very fast thrash with vocals that are more almost straight up death metal recorded better years later. It's a weird recording, but it's also really fucking good. But what else we got? Oh yeah, probably the most recent out of all the classic stuff. This band came along a little bit later. This is Epidemic with Decameron. This one has by far the best production. The one that stands out of this pack musically more than anything else. They definitely slow the tempos down. They have a few songs that are straight up, you know, mid-tempo. It doesn't straightforward thrash the whole way through, and they probably are the one that sounds closest to death metal. Musically, the riff structures, song structures are very thrash, dialed way up to 11, but the vocals are almost straight up death metal. This band was fucking awesome. This is the only thing I have by them, Decameron on Metal Blade, this cassette. They have 3 full lengths, I think, and some demos. And this record in particular got re-released on The Crypt a while ago, on Dark Symphony's The Crypt, maybe 3 years ago. So I don't know if it's still available, but I kind of would like to upgrade. But if it's still up there, still on the website, maybe Dark Descent still has copies, pick it up, because if you like that kind of thing, because this is definitely worth your money. Any more? Oh yeah, before I forget, before I wrap this up, you can't get out of this without mentioning Incubus, aka Opprobrium. This band was from New Orleans, along with Exhorter. I read somewhere they were originally from Brazil. I don't know if that's like kind of an Inquisition sort of scenario, but they lived in New Orleans when they recorded this anyway. 2 albums under this name. And then they had to change their name because of the modern rock band, of course. I've heard the reissues on Relapse of this. This is far more stripped down sounding and thin sounding, but I kind of prefer it actually to the remastered version. It's way more just scrappy and mean and pissed. Also, vocally, same kind of deal. Raspy, shouting, almost death metal, but not quite. And very pummeling, very quick. I mean, you only have 8 songs on this, and they're over in a hot minute. There's only a few songs over 5 minutes long. Just a great thrash record. Not much else to say other than that. This also is an original pressing, before I get out of here with that. This came out on Brutal Records. Black vinyl, don't need to show you that. But obviously the reissues are with their new name, Opprobrium. I know that Metal Mind or some other label reissued their stuff maybe 10 years ago or so, and there was some re-recorded lyrics from what I remember people saying, and some stuff changed around because they went in a more Christian direction lyrically. Not sure if that's true or not. Maybe people can verify and school me on that. I don't know if the Relapse reissues went back with the old lyrics and the old recordings. I was just happy to pick up an original with the original name of the band on it, so that's enough nerd shit in that regard. Alright, so let's talk about this 90s metallic hardcore, proto metalcore, whatever type of shit. So I grew up with this stuff. This was the first music I was exposed to live. And the bands that I like from it, I like a great deal, as I mentioned. I think one of the Mac Daddies of them all, one of the grand poobahs of the genre, is definitely Rorschach. This is a fucking nightmare of a record. Protestant. Their other LP, Remains to Date, is also quite good, but is way more straightforward hardcore, I'd say, although it's very unique for what it is as well. This isolation and paranoia and depression just ooze out of this record. A lot of people describe this band as sort of like the hardcore Voivod. I could see that. They have some technical, weird kind of Voivod riffing. They do have their fair share of kind of fast, more punk or hardcore influence kind of stuff. The vocals are completely shredded, desperate, screeching, shouting, strangulated, unhappy kind of vocals. And they'd go on to, I think, influence everybody and their mother that came after. This is like more or less ground zero for that vocal style. Jacob Bannon from Converge definitely was heavily influenced by Charles Maggio, the singer from this band. And this is a groundbreaking record. This is what started all of that stuff. Any of that stuff with the screeching vocals and the off-tempo kind of riffs and all that shit, like Converge and many Curl Up and Die and a lot of that stuff that was blowing up in the late 90s, owe everything to Rorschach. I love Rorschach, not so much into those other bands. This came out on a label called Gern Blandstein. All this stuff got reissued and remastered in a 2 LP set that has both LPs. They also had a lot of singles. They had a great split with a band called Neanderthal from California that was a precursor to Man is the Bastard. That has a great split. They had a discography CD a long time ago that had everything, including the 2 LPs and the singles. Unfortunately, it kind of sounded like shit. The collection that's remastered now sounds much better. I just picked it up. Play it in my car all the time. It's wonderful. But yeah, wonderful band. Extremely influential. I guess I can't stress that enough. Then I just have this whole stack of CDs here. People have been talking about Bloodlet a little bit, which is good to see. For my money, it doesn't really go past their first album, Entheogen. This is a collection of singles and 7 inches. Never got into anything past Entheogen, but I love Entheogen and I love this stuff quite a bit. Just this wild, like, churning, almost kind of dreamlike or nightmare-like, heavy. I could see people calling it sludge, but it's not. It's not like ripping off Black Sabbath riffs or anything like that. It's very, very of its own style, almost weirdly jazzy. Tortured vocals that are kind of more of a rasp than a shriek. The earliest stuff almost sounds like the slower Integrity material. I feel like Integrity were just as influential as Rorschach, kind of bringing this new sound into the 90s. But this band is fucking amazing. There's a killer Barton Fink sample on this where John Goodman's screaming, I'll show you the life of the mind. Great bass lines that just kind of weave throughout all the songs. Fantastic band. They were great live when they started. They used to play my hometown all the time. I got to see them probably at least 3 times between 94 and 98. They were always really, really good live. Then we got The Swarm. Parasitic Skies. This compiles a 10-inch and a split 7-inch. This band was from Canada. Chris Callahan, vocalist for Left 4 Dead, went on to sing for Cursed. This was a cool amalgamation of influences and a lot of different stuff that they were listening to. I recently listened to an interview with the singer Chris Callahan on that Turned Out a Punk podcast, and he was talking about what they were all listening to at the time, and it was such a cool bunch of things. Like, they were listening to Acme a ton, who Mike talked about, who are this really dense sounding, almost like Seasons era Slayer, the slower parts mixed with Rorschach, just tortured hell chamber kind of music. They were influenced by that. They were influenced by a lot of the German metallic hardcore that was getting big at the time, including Acme, but also Morser and bands like that, Morser and Sistral, which were incredibly heavy. This has got a lot of tracking. It's very layered. There's a fair amount of, like, you know, neck-breaking fast parts on it too. You could tell that they were probably listening to some Drop Dead and some Power Violence, but very metallic, like very strong riffs, you know, not really that much in the way of leads or anything like that, but very Slayerish kind of riff parts and stuff. Great. Cool band. I never got to see them live. I was also a very big fan of Left 4 Dead, and I always liked Cursed. I wasn't huge on them, but, you know, I think this CD is still available for not too much. My copy's pretty fucked up. This has traveled around with me quite a bit. Hopefully it still plays. I haven't listened to it in forever. But also Chris Callahan, one of my favorite lyricists. Up there with Brendan from SFA and Paul Bearer, Rob Pennington. As far as the hardcore lyricists, just very smart guy, and you can tell. Then we got Nama. Amen backwards. Nama. Bring Our Curses Home. This is on Sound Pollution Records. It's a compilation of all of their recorded works. They did I think a 12-inch, bunch of 7 inches. But this stuff is also kind of along the lines of The Swarm being really fast and metallic. There's a little bit more of that sort of dissonant early like that 90s screamo emo-ish kind of stuff on it. Also one of the first bands to have like a very distinct black metal influence coming from hardcore that I can remember. There's a song called Lidless Eye that's an obvious nod to Lord of the Rings. Long before that thing was kind of thing was commonplace. At least I don't think it was ever commonplace in hardcore, but before the movies came out, before it was all over the place, really. But Lidless Eye is strongly influenced by black metal, and perhaps I'll throw a clip up right here. This band was from Michigan. All the songs are really short and pretty impactful, really good. Then we have Catharsis. This is my favorite Catharsis recording. Well, it's actually several. This is compiles demos, comp appearances, 7-inch stuff, you know, one of those odds and ends kind of thing. This is their earliest work. They kind of fell off for me a couple of releases after this. The first time I saw them was with Integrity in Rochester, New York. This was 1997, 1998. And I remember getting really into bands like Filth and Destroy and Disrupt and stuff like that at that time, and seeing them live and being like, wow, they don't look like it, but this is almost like a straight-up crust band. And then buying the CD and bringing it home and being like, live it sounded like that, but it's more like just really fast metal, metallic hardcore kind of stuff. But that, politically, I'm sure they were influenced by a lot of crust stuff. Very left-leaning sort of lyrics that are very fire and brimstone, which I really liked. There's a lot of biblical stuff on this. You know, there's a song called Isaac. There's a song called Corinthians, like that sort of thing. A lot of allegorical sort of talking about heaven and hell and being your own master and stuff like that. I saw them years later with Converge, and I didn't enjoy them nearly as much. Kind of came off as like a very big like hippie love fest kind of thing. Their singer was acting very, very much like a weird Messiah type guy, and it kind of turned me off. But this and their first album are great. Samsara, very, very good band. There's not too much I can say about their musical style that Mike hasn't already said, but like very fast, kind of speed metal paced stuff. Great, gruff, kind of growled sort of vocals. Excellent sense of melody. There's some good solos in there even. It's before that Melodeath thing really took over with the influence on this kind of hardcore, this kind of metallic hardcore or whatever. But you can definitely see that was starting to affect it a little bit, and it wasn't a bad thing at all. Not that they were straight up ripping off At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul parts or anything, because they weren't, thankfully. There's a couple of covers on this. They do Sick People by Breakdown, which is one of my favorite songs, and they do it really well. They also do Our Fight by Confront, which is an anti-racism anthem and a fucking killer song. Ironically, Confront turned into One Life Crew, and that went on to have a few not so nice things to say about immigrants, which was a big divisive thing back in the 90s and still, I think. Anyway, yeah, Catharsis, great record. Mess with it, play with it, check it out. Now I'll talk about a couple bands that were around in the late 90s in my hometown that I just loved, and I'm sure probably most people haven't heard of, or maybe many people that weren't around for this particular era may not have heard of. This band, God Below, they had a split with Ringworm, a split CD. They were around for a handful of years, I want to say from like maybe 97 or so till 2000, 2001. I can't think of anybody that sounds like this. They have a certain sludgy quality. I remember that time in Syracuse, everybody was really, really into Down and that sort of thing, and COC, that era of COC. And you can hear that influence, but there's way more of a almost classic heavy metal style of melody on it that reminds me of some of the Melodeath stuff, but also like kind of almost like Ride the Lightning era Metallica. They're the slower stuff. Pissed, scary, drill sergeant-ish kind of hardcore vocals, but with a good depth and range to them, via courtesy of Danny Johnson. And just it's just some of the most memorable songwriting I can pick out of a lineup for this era of music, like this style of music. I'll have to throw in a clip, I think, because I want to show you guys what I'm talking about. But yeah, slow but not doomy, plodding in mid-pace. There's a little bit of mosh-inducing chugging there, but there's a purpose for it. You know, it carries out into, you know, an actual point, like goes into a good riff that you can remember and not just riding the E. The guitarist for this band was Chris Weichman, who played in Earth Crisis, and he left that band and joined these guys. He was also in Blood Runs Black, the band that predated this, that were also really, really good. And then finally, a band I'm sure like most people haven't heard of because they never got past the demo status. Only played for a couple of years. This tape is completely desiccated and fucked. Barely plays. Thankfully, I just got some MP3s of it from my buddy John. Thanks, John. This is Order of Deceit, self-titled demo. This band gigged a lot in Syracuse at the end of the 90s. One of the most memorable gigs I'd ever seen that was like not a lot of bands that I'm even that into, but was just a great stacked lineup with Neurosis, Brutal Truth, I Hate God, Dead and Gone, Overcast, Unsane, and these guys opening. That was a gig. They were really almost a straight-up technical death metal band. The vocals are very much of that like metalcore-ish kind of shrieking, sort of Rorschach and Converge-inspired sort of thing. Maybe a little bit more deep, a little bit more metal. But the bassist and the guitarist, the bassist was that guy Matt that I've talked about numerous times, who was like the kid that I did the zine with, that I was like my one death metal buddy for a couple of years at shows. He played bass, and this guy Jason, aka Jocko, played guitar, and they were straight up metalheads. They weren't into hardcore really at all, and they killed it. Like there's a lot of proto pre-tech death kind of influence on this, I'd say, like namely like Cynic and Atheist, and even stuff that was a bit more brutal but also technical, like Suffocation. There's only 2 songs on this, and this is almost a half an hour long. They're definite epics. The first song's only like 6 minutes, and the other one's like 15 or something crazy like that. So yeah, 20 minutes. But fantastic, just all over the place songwriting wise, which is normally something I don't like. But the riffs are just so tasty and so good. If you liked stuff like Lethargy from Rochester, if anybody remembers that band, who predated Mastodon, if you liked early Dillinger Escape Plan, if you like Human Remains, Ripping Corpse, early Converge, Acme, like this is all kind of a mishmash of like all that stuff, but it's just as much, if not more, death metal than it is hardcore, and I fucking loved it, and I wish they would have done more, but they went on to do other stuff. Keith, the vocalist, went on to be the guy who booked the original Hellfest that was in the United States, that had a bunch of years in Syracuse, then a few years in Jersey, and then some shit happened. Wasn't going on anymore. But he also sang in a band called Found Dead Hanging, and a bunch of others that, whatever, not really my thing, but man, Order of Deceit. I'll put up a clip for this. I actually think I'm gonna probably take those MP3s and make my first purely music upload and put it up for you guys to enjoy, because it should be heard. It's a great, fucking fantastic demo that's completely lost to the sands of time, because the band just kind of dissolved and stopped doing anything. So that's it. Those are my 2 genres. I hope you enjoy it. I think I might do a follow suit with Mike's. I have a bunch of great hardcore records that I enjoyed from the 90s. Mine might lead a little bit more into the pure hardcore punk direction, as well as maybe a few of the more metal ones, but I think I'm going to do that probably next. I also have a bunch of new stuff to talk about that I've just gotten in. I might film that right now, film in bulk, you know? We'll see. Right now, I really got to take a whiz, so I'm gonna bounce. But you guys have a good one.